Oh, we can see well now.
All right, everybody, welcome to this edition of the Class of 78 Zoom meeting. We're breaking from tradition and we're going to have a bit of a serious discussion today. As I tell you what, all of us know that Will Pomeranz, or Dr. Pomeranz, was a sharp guy when we were in high school, but after reading his bio, I'm uber impressed. So just give you a quick background on Will or Dr. Pomeranz. He's the acting director of the Wilson Center Kennan Institute. He is an expert guide to the complexities of political and economic developments in Russia, particularly through the lens of law. And as you know, he obviously graduated from our class, but then you look at where he went to school. He has taught at the Woodrow Wilson International Centers for Scholars in Washington, D.C. He has taught Russian law at the Center for Eurasian, Russia, and Eastern European Studies as part of Georgetown University. He holds a Bachelor of Arts from Haverford College, a Master's of Science from Edinburgh, a J.D. cum laude from American University, and a Ph.D. in Russian history from the School of Slavic and Eastern European Studies, the University of London. So, Will, like I said, we knew you were smart in high school, but you have probably got more degrees than most of us on this Zoom call. So it's very appropriate that you're going to lead us through a very serious topic, and this obviously what's going on in Ukraine. And it was like, I'm going to turn it over to Chris, and he's going to sort of be the moderator, and we'll just then go from there and have some, hopefully a really good discussion. So thanks for everybody for joining. Like I said, we got 22 people, so I think it's a great show. See you guys. Take it over, Smythe.
Great, thank you, John, and welcome, Will. Before we get going, I think it's a good idea if we all put our microphones on mute, just to limit the background noise. But anyway, Will, welcome. So I think the first question I think we all want to know is, how did you get involved in Russian legal studies?
Well, for my sins, I did a PhD, as John said, in Russian history. And after a while of struggling to find a topic, I did my PhD on the history of the pre-revolutionary Russian legal profession. And after that, I worked at the National Endowment for Democracy and went to law school at night, and actually was able to practice law in Moscow for about 2 years. So my wife always jokes that I'm the only person who actually became their PhD dissertation topic. And so I focused on Russian law as a way to try to understand both the history and the forms in the post-Soviet era. And it turned out to be an excellent window on what was happening in Russia, and also what was happening in Ukraine. So I've been able to live in Moscow, visit Ukraine on several occasions. I discovered late in life that I was in fact from a part of Europe that is now part of Ukraine. So I've taken some Ukrainian Ukrainian heritage for myself as well. So that's the short answer to a very long question.
I assume you're fluent in Russian?
Yes.
Wow, that's so impressive. That's terrific. Okay, so with all that's going on in the world, I guess I'd like to hear your thoughts on what really, in your opinion, was the root cause of this Russian invasion of Ukraine.
So the root cause rests with one person, and that is Vladimir Putin. And about 3 or 4 months ago, he issued a statement where he basically said that Ukraine did not have a history, and that Ukraine, in fact, only existed as a united part of Russia. And he referred to various documents and various stages of Russian history. But it's because that Putin doesn't acknowledge that Ukraine is an independent nation, and that Ukraine cannot be independent, that he decided that he needed to launch this invasion. And I believe that Putin is the only one in Russia who believes that he can deal with the issue of Ukrainian independence. Ukraine voted for independence in 1990 in a referendum. Gorbachev was not willing to use force. Yeltsin was not willing to use force. Indeed, he recognized an independent country and independent Ukraine. But Putin never recognized this, always thought that Ukraine should be a part of the Russian Empire and in the Russian orbit. And I think Putin decided that this was really his last attempt, his last try to correct what he thought was a historical wrong and the breakup of the Soviet Union and an independent Ukraine. And that, I think, is why he decided to do this.
At the end of the day, were you at all surprised that he invaded, or do you think he was bluffing?
I think we're all surprised only because I think we thought that it would cause such an economic catastrophe that he wouldn't do it. But I think Putin believed that the sanctions would not be implemented, that he had survived sanctions before, especially during the Crimean crisis when he annexed Crimea. We thought that we put pretty serious sanctions then on Russia, and they didn't dissuade him, and they really didn't stop Russia's economic development. So I think he thought that the West would not put on sanctions, that they couldn't be unified sanctions to begin with, and that he could survive sanctions.
Okay. So given the events of the past 14 days, do you think that Russia still can succeed in this annexation of Ukraine? I mean, is it,
Say it again, Chris?
Can you guys hear me okay? Because
Not really.
not really.
No.
Now you're better, Chris. Now you're better.
Okay, try this again. Anyway, do you think he will ultimately be successful in annexing Ukraine?
It depends on whether his strategy can work. But his strategy at this point is that he just wants to level Ukraine and then take it over. And he's done this before. He's done this in Chechnya in the early 2000s, where he simply destroyed all the infrastructure of Chechnya. He did this in certain cities in Syria, where he turned Aleppo into a parking lot. And I think that that's the strategy now. Whether he can succeed, I think, is more doubtful. The Russian army has not performed very well in this exercise. There's lots of desertions now. He doesn't really have the number of troops to occupy Kiev or some of the other major cities. And it's quite clear now that he will need boots on the ground in order to take over Ukraine if that's his major objective. And I don't think the Russian army, based on its performance, is going to be able to take over major cities in light of Ukrainian resistance.
Yeah, I mean, I can't imagine. I've heard other pundits say that he just won't be able to hold Kiev. And he doesn't have the manpower, and nor are they skilled enough to do this. And an insurrection there, an insurgency, I should say, is going to be their death knell. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I think Ukraine, even if they lose ground, will engage in an insurgency. They did so in World War II and in the immediate aftermath of World War II when it was reintegrated into the Soviet Union. They've, at various stages in their history, they've did similar heroic acts in order to resist capture and so forth. And therefore, I think that, yes, Ukraine is in a position to take these casualties. Whether there are enough Ukrainians to do it is another question. Clearly, after 2 million plus refugees, there is a question of whether Ukraine can continue this fight. But it's quite clear that they have all the incentives on their side, and the Russians do not.
What do you think, in your opinion, Putin's biggest misjudgment was, and or series of misjudgments?
There are lots of misjudgments. I think the first one is that he could launch this invasion without explaining why. Indeed, he just launched he used terminology that kind of was left over from World War II, but didn't actually describe the situation. So that when he accused Ukraine of genocide, when he accused it of being neo-Nazi, he didn't have anything to back it up with. And obviously the rest of the world realized that it was all a lie. And so not only does the world know that it's a lie, but he can't even tell the Russian population why they are going into Ukraine. So there's all this disinformation and lies in the Russian media, but in about a week or two, Russians will find out that they have no money, they have no currency, and they have no hope, and that will be an even bigger test for Vladimir Putin. One that he can survive, I should add, but is something that I do not expect he thought he had to deal with this early in this operation.
Okay, can you talk a little bit, based on what you know, about Putin's character and his mental state? I mean, is this guy nuts?
Well, I do believe he's isolated from a lot of people. I think if a picture can tell 1,000 words, then his meetings on that big table with his advisors, his economic advisors, right, where they were 30 feet apart, and he's all by himself at one end of the table, surrounded by nobody. And then 4 or 5 economic advisors, the people who have to deal with this mess that he created, at the end of the table. Clearly, he's not in touch with his staff. He has humiliated various members of his inner council during this crisis. I think that he is not in touch with any sort of anyone who can say no, or anyone who can refute anything that he says. And therefore, you know, with that type of isolation, he thought that he could do it and not even tell anybody and not do the preliminary steps to make it successful.
That's just scary that he's operating in a vacuum like that. And,
yeah, well, he's operated for this in at least 2 years. He has self-isolated himself. I learned today that when people see Vladimir Putin, and these are people who he's trusted for decades, they have to quarantine for 2-3 weeks, even to get an appointment. He has just isolated himself from the world, from this population, and feels that, you know, if he is in control of the media and the major industries, that he can just do this.
What do you think the odds are that either his staff or his generals will just rise up and do the right thing here?
I do not think that his generals will do the right thing. They are a pretty feckless bunch who have no history of kind of independent thought or independent action. They are all dependent on their relationship to Putin. There is talk that maybe some of the oligarchs will rise up and say, you know, that this is not working and this has to change. But again, they're all dependent on Putin. They're sailing their yachts to safe harbor so that they can enjoy their luxuries. And in many ways, I don't know if the oligarchs are going to be able to tell Putin what's wrong. And so that's going to leave the Russian population and protests. And Putin has put severe restrictions on the ability to demonstrate, the ability to criticize the government, to criticize the war effort. He's closed down all the major independent news outlets, and indeed passed legislation that has declared any attempt to disseminate fake information is punishable for up to 15 years in jail. And I assure you that that penalty will be enforced if he needs to.
Well, I want to ask a couple questions just around, what maybe motivated him to do this other than this, grand, idea that he wants to reunite the old Soviet Union. But as far as his motivation to do it now, I mean, do you think that the West was too passive when he invaded, Georgia in 2008, and Crimea in 2014? And go on.
We were passive, the invasion of Georgia and the recognition of South Ossetia was not really newsworthy that would sway kind of public opinion in the United States. And when he took over Crimea in 2014, it was just a done deal. And it was a done deal because Russia still had a Navy base and soldiers in Crimea, and he could do it very well, easily. And we weren't going to be able to challenge him in Russia's backyard. As I said, we did put severe sanctions, or what we thought was going to be severe sanctions on the Russian finance and Russian energy and Russian individuals, but it turned out that it wasn't really enough to make a difference. But this time, the response has been overwhelming, and the ruble's now junk. They can't import anything that they have gotten used to, and it's taken Putin 15 days to destroy what Russia built up after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 30 years. So it's just catastrophic.
It's the most amazing thing about this whole thing is what they've done to themselves in such an incredibly short period of time.
Well, what Putin has done to them, I mean, admittedly, Russians, whether they were too passive or not, we can debate that, but this is the result of one person's and a coterie of advisors around him decision. And so Russians they don't have free elections, they don't have a free media, they don't have a lot of things that they can do to challenge Putin's power. And so it just continues.
Do you think that Putin saw NATO as being, at this moment in time, just, disjointed and weak, and that he could take advantage of the moment?
I think he's always thought NATO was disjointed and weak, and never really understood how we won the Cold War, quite frankly. But I think if NATO did not have a reason or was questioning its unity and reason to exist, the last 15 days have given it a new mission.
Hey, Chris, Heberton has a question. So
yeah, hey, Will, what will it take for China to deserve Putin? When does Putin go too far that China says it enough? They're out. They're no longer support him, or is there a point too far with China?
Well, I think China likes certainty, and Putin has introduced a real level of uncertainty into global finance and basically, international affairs and politics. But I don't think at the present time that China really wants to make a statement and go against Russia. What I think China expects out of this is the continued weakening of Russia, and Russia will be a junior partner to the Chinese experience. And I think that's just going to be the way it is. And Putin will just have to face that. And, he'll have to ship oil, and he'll get some hard currency or something like that. He'll send the raw materials to China, but he will just increasingly be a subsidiary of the Chinese corporation.
Hey, Luca, did you have a question?
Oh, yeah. Talking about this, of course, since the sanctions are hitting really hard on Russia's economy, well, that makes Russia more and more dependent on China. Well, we are pretty scared of the fact that at the end of this mess, we will have Russia completely in the arms of China. In the new balance, that could be a problem. I mean, here in Europe, we feel pretty much this situation because before all this mess, of course, ties between the EU and Russia were growing stronger and stronger. And so letting a little bit out of China's influence. I don't know, are you scared about this? I mean, that create an axis, Russia, China against the West?
Well, again, the axis of Russia-China will primarily relate to China, and that Russia will not be really contributing to this axis and will just have to go along with it. Now, that causes problems and serious consequences for Europeans and Americans and the global economy. And, you know, the security architecture going forward, that is not an insignificant issue. But the idea that somehow Russia will be able to influence what China does, or that even a alliance, and there's not an alliance between Russia and China right now, there's cooperation, as it were. Russia promises not to invade during the Olympics, and China tells Russia what to do. And so that, I think, is just going to be a continued reality. But the ability for Europeans and Americans to interact with Russia after this unprovoked invasion and aggression will be very limited until somehow, you know, basic ties are restored. And in light of what Russia is doing and will continue to have to do in Ukraine to conquer it or pacify it, I don't see, you know, the Europeans and the Americans going back to Russia anytime soon.
Will, tell me, do you think he will stop at Ukraine,
Thank
or you know, what's next?
Yeah, there's talk that he might want a part of Moldova, but Moldova is not that big if he wants it. I mean, what he's done already is he's essentially incorporated Belarus into Russia. Now, they had a union treaty for several years, and clearly Russia saved the president of Belarus, Lukashenko, during the uprising and protests a year ago. So they already were close ties, but basically the independence of, or the ability to act as a third party for Belarus has basically been reduced to zero. And it used to be that Belarus would at least try to negotiate these types of problems between Russia and Ukraine, and they're just not in position to do so anymore.
Hey, Hababny's got his hand up and he's patiently waiting.
Oh, go on, Todd. Where are
Hey,
you?
Will.
Hey, Todd, how you doing?
Good. How are you, man?
Very well,
This is
thanks.
great. Thanks for your time. Two questions. One is, to what extent do the Russian people and the military have access to the internet or any kind of information that allows them to know what atrocities are going on in Ukraine and the whole situation? Do they have any knowledge of this? Or are they just totally shut off from news?
Not only do they, if they have, they still might have access to the internet, but Putin has basically reversed the narrative and said that, you know, it is Ukraine that is fighting Russia, and it is Ukraine that is terrorizing the people of Donetsk and Luhansk, the two separate regions of Ukraine, and that this is the genocide of Ukraine. And do people in Russia believe that? I think initially they do, and their ability to get counter arguments is limited. And so the pictures in Russia are based on what the leadership is saying. And the foreign minister Lavrov, he just said yes today that, you know, we're not invading Russia, it's Ukraine that's invading. Russia's not invading Ukraine, Ukraine is invading Russia.
Wow.
And all this types of disinformation is not being challenged inside the country. Now, obviously, there are a lot of people who know the truth in Russia, and there have been protests in Russia that have led to the imprisonment of thousands of people. But they don't have the ability to change the government, but with the economic catastrophe that awaits them, we'll just have to wait and see whether more people go to the streets or not.
Right.
That was gonna be one of my questions. Do you think that's a plausible outcome at the end of the day, that the Russian people will just revolt? They'll have another revolution and throw out the government? I mean, is that
They occasionally revolt, but Putin has made sure that he has control of obviously the media, but also the militia and the police and the prosecutor's office and a host of other institutions to make sure that that doesn't happen.
There you go.
And Russia is a highly centralized, top-down state, and that in order to break that, it happens about once a century. And so if it happens now, then it would be a pleasant surprise. But it has to take a concerted effort that Putin, at least in the short term, everyone believes, has the ability to put down. Now, I will say that up until a month ago or 2 months ago, everyone thought that Nursultan Nazarbayev, the head of Kazakhstan, who had been the head of Kazakhstan even longer than Putin had been head of Russia, was very secure. And he went in a week. You know, the protest and the protests were not even that dramatic. So, in spite of the fact that Putin may believe that he's safe, autocrats, when they fall fast and hard.
That's right. Hey, Smythe, we got a question from
All right.
Australia.
all right? John?
Hey, Will, good to see
Hey,
you.
John, how you doing?
I'm doing great. It's a little bit of a side topic, but I'm kind of curious if your interest in Russia had anything to do with the czar at the university school, Dave Chalet, and whether I'm not sure if he's still around.
You know, I think everyone, you know, everyone knows Dave, and I had many a talk, many a summit with Dave, talking about topics on Russian history, and obviously that was one of the great sparks that raised my interest in it. And I haven't been to Cleveland for a while, but I always used to visit Dave and see how he was doing, and we would have long talks about obscure topics that only the two of us were interested in, and then we would have a good time.
That's good to hear.
Cool. Let's throw it over to Gullis, Smythe, and then we'll come back to you.
Hey, Will, how you doing?
Very good, Greg. How are you?
I drove by your old house on Demington the other day. I was thinking about you.
Wow, yeah, that's a long time ago.
It's a long time ago. So Dave Chalet, well, there's a name I haven't heard in a while. That's for sure. So two questions. The first one I think you probably answered is on the opposition within Russia. You know, what would it take to get rid of Putin, to depose him, essentially? I think you've already answered that. The second question is relates to the reaction of the West. You know, a lot of the hawks think that we've been too passive in how the West has reacted. And one factoid, apparently 90% of the Russian army is now occupied in Ukraine. So I think to some people that seems like an opportune time to really do something aggressive against Russia, since 90% of his army is occupied in one particular location. So any comment about, you know, potentially more aggressive actions by the West?
I think the West is very concerned that if it pushes too far and it pushes Putin too far, it will get a response that will be catastrophic. And this is why I think we were unwilling to send Ukraine the Soviet MiGs from Poland. And I think that I don't think that we will test Russia's internal resolve and somehow provoke a nuclear exchange or something like that. That Putin has basically said that that Russia is at economic war with the United States. He has said that nuclear weapons are not necessarily off the table. And I don't think that the United States wants to test Putin to see if that is true. So I don't think that we would take it to take a military operation to Russia. I don't think that 90% of the Russian army is actually engaged in Ukraine.
Okay.
In fact, I think that's significantly less of the number is significantly less. And he really doesn't have that many more troops that he can throw at Ukraine in order to pacify it. So I don't think has 90% engaged in this struggle. What we've seen amongst the Russian conscripts is that they're conscripts. They don't know why they're fighting. They don't know why they're there. In fact, they don't know where they are. No one told them that they were going into Ukraine. No one prepared them for fighting. And so with all those things, all those factors, I don't think that we would risk seeing how far Putin would go.
I have a question, a little off topic, but related. I read a book, you've probably heard of it, called Red Notice by Bill Broder.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
An incredible story how he was there when the Soviet Union blew apart. He was an investment banker, and he started just glomming on all these industries, and he wound up being in competition with the oligarchs and then ultimately Putin. And Putin was a really bad guy early on, and has been trying to kill this guy. It led to this, I don't want to mispronounce it, the Magnitsky Act?
Magnitsky, yeah.
Yeah. Were you involved in that? In some of
No, I was not. I did not write the Magnitsky Act. No one consulted me about the Magnitsky Act. It was passed at the time when Russia was joining the World Trade Organization, and President Obama didn't want the Magnitsky Act. He wanted kind of to to integrate Russia into global trade without dealing with any sort of add-ons or additions. But in order to join the World Trade Organization, we had to repeal the Jackson-Vanik Amendment, Vanik being the famous congressman from Northeastern Ohio. And so that was an iconic piece of human rights legislation. It basically said we wouldn't give most favored nation trade status to Russia unless they dealt with the Jewish immigration to Israel. And so that was a real obstacle for Russia. And in the early 1990s, there was free immigration from Russia to Israel. So everyone thought that that wasn't really necessary anymore. And so when Magnitsky was essentially tortured in jail and died in jail, and Browder was his boss, Browder had got a lot of money and used his connections and was able to pass the Magnitsky Act. It only put sanctions on a very limited number of people. Indeed, the only people who were initially sanctioned were the people who killed Magnitsky in the Russian jail, and they were not likely to be traveling anytime overseas anyway. So it really didn't have that much of an impact on Russia's attitude or behavior. But Putin was really upset about that because he wanted a clean act, and Obama himself wanted a clean act. Browder managed to get the Magnitsky Act. Browder, I should add, is no angel in this. He was in Russia in the 1990s when Russian capitalism was the wild, wild west, and he was the wild, wild west as well. And I'm sure his father was very, I don't know if his father was still alive when Browder went to the former Soviet Union, but Browder's father was a leading communist and in the West. And I'm sure he would have been very perplexed as to why his son was becoming a capitalist in Russia.
Just curious.
Hey, Smythe,
I'm out of questions.
Dr. Stewart has a question, and then we'll go back to Bruce as a follow-up question.
Jack?
Well, Will, like everybody, thanks so much. And here's to the class of 78. Smythe, Johnny, thanks. But my question, going back to you said Putin being so isolated, is there anything, if this goes on for a while, that would allow him to save face in some way, or is he just too far gone that that's not even possible?
Well, he did not build in a path of retreat. Indeed, when he initially challenged the West, he just put in two demands that the United States and the Europeans couldn't agree to. And that was the end of the open door for NATO admission and the rollback of NATO expansion to pre-1997. And these were just two non-starters to begin with. And they just weren't serious options for negotiation. And so he put on the table kind of non-negotiable demands. And so there's no path back for Putin from my perspective. He also wanted to try to negotiate independence for these two republics in Ukraine, Donetsk and Luhansk, and he wanted to essentially give them veto power over any sort of national legislation. But Putin himself, having recognized them as independent countries, has lost that advantage as well. So he can't go back to what was called the Minsk agreements or the Minsk formula. And so he doesn't have a path to retreat. And everyone says that, is there an off-ramp? And for Putin, who in the aftermath of these actions, most likely will find himself a war criminal. Under indictment in the International Court of Justice, that I don't think that he has a path back, unless of course the West gives him a path, and I have every there is every possibility that the West has short memories, and if impossible, would give him some sort of path to redemption. But obviously, in light of the pictures of Ukraine, in light of 2 million refugees in Europe now, 2 million refugees in Europe from Ukraine, I don't think that he can get the free pass that he might have thought he could have gotten.
Wow. Everton, you have a follow-up question?
You're mute, Bruce. Bruce, mute.
Yeah.
Having spent time in Russia, I mean, do you have any sense of what the average Russian person, does he buy the Putin narrative that keeping Ukraine from joining the Western Europe, the Union, or NATO is vital to Russian security? Does the average Russian buy into that? Are they still threatened by the West?
I think the average Russian kind of thinks of Ukraine as a friendly neighbor. Most Russians have parents or grandparents in Ukraine. That is really one of the shocking things about this invasion, that so many Russians have direct connections to Ukraine, and yet Putin launched this tragic attack against Ukraine. So I think that they have always considered themselves, brothers to a certain extent, but Ukraine has kind of advanced its independence over 30 years. And I don't think that Ukraine thinks of itself as a little brother to Russia anymore. Yeah. And they've consistently voted for independence and have actually staged 2 revolutions to prevent the election, the false election of a pro-Russian president. So I think Ukraine has a strong identity now. And obviously, if they didn't have one before this invasion, they have it now.
Okay, thanks.
Hey, Smokey's got his hand raised.
Thank you. Will, really appreciate this information. It's quite interesting to have your expertise, especially with the varying reports from media. But I have two sort of follow-up questions from parts of things that you touched on. One is in the morning, I have coffee at Davis Bakery on Chagrin Boulevard nearly every morning. And one of the guys that sort of hangs out in this little think tank group is a bunch of 60-year-old, we're all a bunch of 60-year-old guys. This guy, he immigrated from Ukraine 33 years ago with his two very young children. And he's showing us videos from his friends that are literally in the middle of this bombing and what's going on. And so the first question is, so you touched on that Putin has gone in and invaded other areas and he leaves them as a parking lot. What would be the motivation and the point of bombing the territory into non-existence to take it over and have it become part of the country again? Or is he going to be, on the take to be rebuilding it and get all the money from that process, sort of as an aside sarcasm? But what does he gain by that? Leveling the country and then Ukraine and then taking it back. And the second question is, you said he doesn't have a path of retreat. So basically this is all or none. Either he goes in and levels it, takes it over at all cost, regardless of what damage it does to Ukraine, those citizens or his people or his economy or his troops. Because if he retreats and says, back off, we're going to negotiate, he becomes a war criminal or he's executed. Those two questions.
So the first question, what does he gain? All great Russian leaders have acquired new territory to establish their greatness, and all Russian leaders who have failed have lost territory to their great historical reputation. Gorbachev is hated because he lost territory. Yeltsin is pretty much despised because he didn't keep all of the Soviet Union together. It goes back in history as to who is a great leader of Russia. And it's not that they bring them freedom. It's not that they bring them, prosperity. To be a great leader in Russia is to acquire territory. And that's what empires do. And I think that people don't recognize Russia as an empire. They kind of think of it as a country. But it is a country that expands over 11 time zones, is a multinational empire. And Putin still thinks of Russia as an empire. And I think that is his motivation, or part of his motivation, that in order to be great, he must reverse the wrong of the collapse of the Soviet Union and get Ukraine back into the Union. And I think he's less concerned about other former republics, but Ukraine is part of the Slavic Brotherhood of the Russian Federation. And I think he wants it back. And he's tried at various stages to get it back, and he has failed at each time. Is it all or nothing? I thought at the beginning that Putin might want to have a strategy where he could declare victory and go home. But in light of what he's done to Kharkiv, Mariupol, and other Ukrainian cities, I just don't think that that's going to happen. And in terms of his military strategy, it turns out that that is the only military strategy that the Russian army is capable of fulfilling, of leaving, of destroying, of leaving, a wreckage of a society and of an infrastructure. And that's how they declare victory. And I was in Russia at the end of the Second Chechen War. And, it was just a city, the Grozny, the main city, the capital city, was just, like World War II, the end of World War II. There was just nothing left of that city. And so that is what the Russian military, we thought that somehow the Russian military was capable of something new. And we thought that it was more of a competent army. But essentially, this is all that they can do. And the fact that, their tanks are just lined up on a 40 mile piece of road, can't move, don't have gas, the soldiers don't have food. It just shows that, despite the billions and trillions that Russia has spent rebuilding its army, it still has, I guess, the same defense plan that it had 30 years ago.
Wow. I think Avery's got his hand up, and then we'll go back to you, Chris, okay?
Thanks. I finally figured out how to put up a hand. It took me a
Yeah,
while.
good job.
Yeah, so Will, by the way, I don't need a consultant for our trip to St. Petersburg anytime soon. So
Oh, very good.
Yeah, we'll put that on hold for a decade or two. So
We'll still be there.
So where do you see things 2 months from now, 6 months from now, and 12 months from now?
2 months from now, I still see the Ukrainians resisting and the Russians trying to take cities. 6 months from now, I think there might be a hint of peace negotiations, but I'm not sure. And in 12 months, if they go according to plan, Ukraine, I don't know, Ukraine will be a part of the Russian Federation, but Ukraine will be depopulated and simply a shadow of the country and the vibrant people that Putin needs to rebuild Ukraine to begin with, and Russia as well.
Great, thanks.
I mean, the intellectual power that is leaving Russia and Ukraine is significant. And I hear stories of they're leaving and they just don't ever attempt to go back. In the 1990s, people went back. They thought, Russian emigres who had been in the United States for a while and for other countries, there were opportunities. They were ability to start a business, ability to kind of rebuild, their careers. And I know a lot of people who went back to Russia. Unfortunately, I'm sure they kept their U.S. passports, and I'm sure that they're trying to figure out a way via Turkey or Kazakhstan or Kyrgyzstan or wherever they need to go to get out of the country.
Great, thanks.
John, you guys ask far better questions than I do, and we've covered most of the topips I was going to ask.
Hey, Will, can I just ask, after all of this, and listening to everything that sort of all leads to this, so with regards to Putin, how does it end for him?
Well, again,
I don't know.
It ends if these there are ways for it to end. It ends if he can't feed people, he can't have an economy, he can't export oil, and the ruble collapses. And
we're comfortable that he's stable to let this all occur around him, and he's not going to do. He's got his hand on the button and things.
Yeah, but he doesn't have his hand on his wallet, and that's his problem. I think when Putin, people have told me that they did various sorts of stress tests as to whether the economy could survive and what sort of sanctions would be implemented. But he never did a stress test if he could not get access to his $300 billion slush fund of hard currency. And that was just a game changer from my perspective. Everyone said that, he had built up this huge reserve for a rainy day, but everyone assumed that he could gain access to this huge slush fund. And, the West said no. And that's just another miscalculation. And a misunderstanding of how this invasion would play out. He just thought he's gotten away with a lot of things, and he just thought he could get away with this.
Will, do you think, are you surprised that he played the nuclear card in day 2?
No. I think it was going so badly that he had to somehow show that he was a superpower, and you shouldn't mess with a superpower. And so he played that card very early. And so I wasn't surprised that he played it. It just in the nuclear age, no one can really play that card and think they can get away with it unless they want to destroy the world. And
my follow-up is, what are the odds of him using nukes in your opinion?
I think they're still limited, because I don't know if he's suicidal yet, but clearly if he were to play the nuclear card, it would just be mass devastation. And quite frankly, he's playing the nuclear card in an indirect way already, by attacking Chernobyl, by not allowing the engineers into Chernobyl, by attacking and lobbing missiles at the largest nuclear power plant in Ukraine. He's already playing, nuclear roulette, as it were, with his troops. And so that is, that again is just a huge concern, because, he's just lobbing these missiles, and, they're going wherever they go.
Let's talk about those nuclear power plants. There's 2. What if they lose their energy source? Will that cause a meltdown?
I leave it to the scientists in this group to explain when it actually melts down. But I assure you that if the engineers can't get access to it, if they lose power that is keeping it running, which is a threat in both of these major power plants, they're playing with disaster. And of course, when they attacked the nuclear station in Zaporozhye, the wind was blowing toward Rostov, towards Russia, as opposed to Ukraine. So again, if you're going to actually do this, you really need to know which way the wind is blowing.
There you go. Hey, Rob Gillison has a question, I think, and then Heberton has one, and maybe then we'll wrap it up.
Hey, Will, it's an honor to be on with the star of C-SPAN. Really appreciate you doing this. You answered Greg's question about hot war, and you're describing, the future, the immediate future, and probably the longer term future here is kind of a nasty slog in Ukraine for a long, long time, with an insurgency and, government in exile and all that. And I have to say that one of the things that I've sort of appreciated seeing has been the response of the West to this. I think it's revitalized the concept of NATO. We're reminded of who the superpower enemy is on the other side of the thing. The question I have for you, though, and this is sort of indirectly related to Russia, only in the sense that people across the table from the Russians. Given the short attention spans of Western democracies, do you think we have the ability to sustain a Cold War II?
I think yes. With obvious certain caveats that events can intervene that can change the equation. But I think this waging an unprovoked war in Europe and all the ramifications of that will lead to Russia's isolation for many years to come.
Yeah.
And so I agree that the West has short memories. And again, it wasn't long until after, during this crisis that we made overtures to Venezuela and to Iran. So, there are always events that intervene. But I think that waging an aggressive war in Europe and breaking all the promises and of the post-Soviet, post-Cold War settlement is a very high price that will not be forgiven easily.
Cool. All right, Haverford, and you get the last question, man, even though it's your
Yeah.
third time.
Yeah, that's enough to hear from me. Thanks. So Will, as you know, Ukraine pipes a lot of Russian oil and natural gas through to Western Europe, and it's the critical pipeline to Western Europe. I mean, can you see any situation where that infrastructure comes under risk, comes at risk?
Well, Russia has built an alternative pipeline that allows it to go outside of the Ukrainian pipeline and give and distribute gas to Europe. Indeed, one of the elements that people thought was sacrosanct was the licensure of what is called the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which would bypass Ukraine and deliver gas directly to the European continent. And indeed, this was before Russia invaded Ukraine, this was the big controversy that Ukraine was going to be denied billions of dollars of transit fees, and Russia would be able to make Europe more dependent on its gas and not have to go through third parties. When Biden became president, there was legislation that had been passed in Congress that required that would have sanctioned the operators of this pipeline. Biden chose not to introduce those sanctions because he wanted to repair relations with Germany. But 6 months later, clearly Germany is not going to license Nord Stream 2 anytime soon, despite the hardship that it will mean for German industry and European energy altogether. But this is now the new reality. We'll be paying for it for a long time at the pump. But nevertheless, Russia's ability to deliver gas to Europe has now been limited.
Hey, John, I just want to step in and thank Will for agreeing to do this and for taking the time and sharing your wisdom. I hope we can do it again, maybe in a few months. See how this thing evolves.
Can we do one more question though? Because Steve Landau, who's the guy on the telephone, has he sent me an email which I just saw, and so because I don't think he can do the chat on the phone. Steve, if you're still there, I saw that you had a couple of questions, and then we'll wrap you up, and then we'll say goodbye if we got 2 more minutes.
Steve, you're on mute. There you go.
Hi, this is Steve here. How are you, Will?
Hi, Steve.
Hey, question is very simply this: every other time, I think you've already answered it, has gone through frozen conflict, right? When you go into Georgia and the post-Soviet states, in terms of that type of story. So why didn't he go for? He obviously what you say is he considers Ukraine to be different. So he didn't want to have a frozen conflict in this area. He chose a very different pathway. You think he did that from the beginning, right?
Well, he wanted a frozen conflict in the sense that he wanted Ukraine to recognize the Luhansk People's Republic and the Donetsk People's Republic as a part of Ukraine, but with an independent veto over Ukrainian legislation. It would mean, that, Ohio could block all pieces of legislation in Congress. And that was his strategy. And it wasn't necessary, and that was what he wanted, I think, to happen. And when Ukraine refused to negotiate and to recognize the breakaway republics, that's when he decided, 1, to recognize them, and 2, to wage this illegal war. So I think he wanted to use the notion of frozen conflicts with a slight variation. But when Ukraine did not cooperate, he decided that he had to revert to military means to teach them a lesson. And I think that's one of the things that he misunderstood.
So the other post-Soviet states essentially acquiesced and allowed him to do it. And what you're saying is Ukraine essentially stood up to him. It wasn't the geography that essentially, and the history of Ukraine, because, you know, if you think about what happened during World War II, where the Soviets come in, then the Nazis come in and go back, these poor people have been bounced around forever. Is it the idea here that he treats this territory different than he thinks of in terms of Georgia and some of the other things he's done in the other post-Soviet states?
Yes, I think Ukraine has always had a special place for the Soviet system. It was a signatory to the creation of the Soviet state. And so forth. And they always considered Ukraine to be Russian. And this is a long historical argument, and it involves multiple nationalities and lots of lost battles in terms of trying to establish Ukrainian identity and trying to form a Ukrainian state. Ukraine showed up at Versailles in the negotiations. It showed up at Brest-Litovsk. It has at times exhibited the attributes of an independent country, only to be reintegrated into the larger Russian Empire and Soviet Union. So I think Ukraine does have a special place in his mind. And that is why I think he is so hostile to the idea that somehow Ukraine can go its own way.
No.
So we may look at all the states as the same, right? Because they're all post-Soviet. The answer is he had a hierarchy, and this is the top of his hierarchy.
Absolutely. And when the Soviet Union collapsed, there are two broad things that led it to collapse. One was imperial fatigue, that Russians didn't want to actually pay for an empire, and Yeltsin was the best representative of that. And the fact that when Ukraine got a chance to vote on independence in its referendum in 1990, over 90% of the population voted for independence. And one should add that a lot of Ukrainians are Russian speakers. And indeed, you can't identify national identity just by language. And that is particularly true for Ukrainians, because some of the most patriotic Ukrainians I've met only spoke Russian.
Yeah.
Well, thank you.
All right. Well, why don't we leave it at that? We'll let Will get back to his vacation. I just want to say we've had about, like, at any point in time, we had about over 25 people on this call. So that's about 25% of our class, right? So I think that's pretty a testament to you, Will, and actually a testament to our class. So anyway, Chris, or Emo, you want to say any parting thoughts? Otherwise, I'm going to stop the recording and then we can just sort of shoot the shit a little bit.
Well, this is great. Well, I'm so impressed that we're actually sort of doing something academic. I'm so cool. I'm lost.
Well, we'll have to undo that and do something very unacademic in a while.
Right.
Exactly.
Bingo.
Guys, off to D-Host.
Off to D-Host. Exactly.
Again,
Bye, everybody.
Smythe, great idea. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Will.
Thanks.